Picture this: a cold January morning in Turin, 1889. A philosopher sees a horse being whipped in the street. He runs towards it, throws his arms around the horse's neck, and breaks down sobbing. This was the last sane act of Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who would spend the next 11 years in complete silence, trapped in his own broken mind. But here's what's fascinating. It wasn't his controversial ideas that drove him mad. It wasn't his declaration that God is dead, or his radical philosophy that broke his brilliant mind. The truth is far more surprising. The same force that made Nietzsche one of history's greatest thinkers also destroyed him: his relentless pursuit of truth through isolation. Think about this. At age 24, Nietzsche became the youngest professor in European history. By 25, he was revolutionizing philosophy. His mind was so sharp that other philosophers couldn't keep up with him. But with each breakthrough, with each new insight, he was unknowingly taking steps toward his own destruction. Most people think Nietzsche went mad because of syphilis, or because his ideas were too radical. But that's not the whole story. In his personal letters, we find something much more chilling. Just 3 months before his breakdown, he wrote to his friend Peter Gast, "I am so sharp that I'm frightened. Yesterday I cried a whole hour in tune with such a violent feeling of life as I have never known." His mind wasn't just breaking, it was accelerating, like a car with no brakes, heading toward a cliff of consciousness. In the weeks before his collapse, he was writing at an impossible pace, completing major works in mere days. His letters became more intense, more prophetic. He wasn't losing his mind in the traditional sense. His mind was expanding until it couldn't contain itself anymore. This wasn't just another philosopher having a mental breakdown. This was a man who had pushed human consciousness to its absolute limit, who had stared so long into the abyss that the abyss started staring back. And in that final moment with the horse in Turin, something in him finally snapped, not with a bang, but with an embrace of pure compassion. The real tragedy? His sister found a note on his desk, written just days before his breakdown. It read, "This time, I will bring humanity a revelation that will make the earth shake, but I am afraid I am becoming too clear to be understood." These would be among the last coherent words he ever wrote. This isn't just a story about madness. It's a warning about the price of pushing our minds too far, too fast, in search of ultimate truth. And as we'll see, Nietzsche's journey to madness reveals something crucial about the human mind that modern science is only now beginning to understand. Following the young Nietzsche's journey shows us exactly how a brilliant mind can unravel. At just 24, he wasn't just teaching at the University of Basel. He was rewriting the rules of classical scholarship. His colleagues were baffled by his appointment. How could someone so young hold such a prestigious position? But Nietzsche's brilliance was undeniable. His sister Elizabeth, who would later become both his caretaker and the controversial editor of his works, wrote him a deeply concerning letter in 1886. "Dear Fritz," she wrote, "your isolation frightens me. You sit alone in those cold Swiss mountains writing for days without speaking to anyone. Even your closest friends say they hardly recognize you anymore." What Elizabeth didn't understand was that Nietzsche wasn't just isolating himself. He was conducting a dangerous experiment with his own mind. In his tiny rented room in Sils Maria, Switzerland, he would spend 10 hours a day in complete solitude, taking long walks in the mountains, pushing his thoughts to places few philosophers had dared to go. His daily routine was extreme. He survived on a diet of fruit and vegetables, claiming meat clouded his thinking. He took massive doses of opium for his chronic migraines, then countered the drowsiness with strong coffee. His doctor warned him that this lifestyle would destroy him, but Nietzsche was obsessed with pushing further. A telling incident occurred in 1877 when his friend Paul Ray visited him. Ray found Nietzsche in a state of extreme agitation, surrounded by manuscripts. "I can't sleep," Nietzsche told him. "The thoughts come too quickly. It's like my mind is a room filling with smoke. I can hardly breathe from all the ideas." But here's what makes this period so crucial. It was exactly this dangerous lifestyle that produced his greatest works. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in just 10 days of intense isolation. Twilight of the Idols took less than a week. He was writing faster than his publisher could print, but with each book, his mental state became more fragile. The real tension wasn't between sanity and madness. It was between his growing insights and his brain's ability to contain them. In his notebook from 1888, just months before his collapse, he wrote, "Sometimes I feel like I'm seeing too much. Every day brings revelations that would take others years to understand. But what if the human mind isn't meant to contain this much truth?" This wasn't just the typical stress of an overworked academic. Nietzsche was deliberately pushing himself to the edge of human consciousness, believing that only there could he find the insights humanity needed. As he wrote to his doctor, "My task is so heavy that it might shatter anyone. But if I succeed, even my breakdown will have been worth it." The stakes couldn't have been higher. Nietzsche was gambling with his sanity for the sake of philosophical truth. And as we'll see in the next section, this gamble would lead to one of the most remarkable mental breakdowns in intellectual history. One that would change how we think about the limits of human consciousness. Philosophy usually warns us about pushing our minds too far. But Nietzsche? He charged straight into the abyss of consciousness. And what happened to him reveals something fascinating about how our minds work and break. Let's look at what was happening in Nietzsche's head during his final sane year, 1888, the year he once called his imperial phase. In just that single year, he wrote 4 major books, each one more intense than the last. But here's what's really interesting: these weren't just regular books. His writing style was changing dramatically. Take Exe Homo, his last work. The chapter titles alone show something wasn't right. Why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books. But inside these seemingly arrogant titles, Nietzsche wasn't just bragging. He was documenting his own mind's expansion. He wrote about experiencing states of consciousness that felt like explosions of force. He described moments where one becomes God. Everything happens by itself in the highest degree involuntarily. His friend Franz Overbeck noticed something strange during his last visit. Nietzsche would suddenly stop mid-conversation, grab his notebook, and write frantically for several minutes, his hand barely able to keep up with his thoughts. When asked what he was writing, Nietzsche replied, "I'm catching lightning." The really bizarre part? His work actually got better during this period. Twilight of the Idols, written just months before his breakdown, is considered one of his clearest, most powerful books. It's like his mind was a rocket engine, burning hotter and hotter, producing incredible power right up until the moment it exploded. We can see this in his letters too. In December 1888, just weeks before his collapse, he wrote to his friend Peter Gast, "The world has become transfigured, for I have found such profound thoughts that it feels like I'm bathing in light." 3 days later, he wrote again, "I fear I am bringing mankind the most difficult decision it has ever faced." But here's where it gets really interesting. Modern neuroscience suggests Nietzsche might have been experiencing what's called hyperfrontality, a state where the brain's front regions become hyperactive. It's the same thing that happens in certain types of genius, and in the early stages of some psychotic breaks. The ancient Greeks had a word for this state, entheos, literally filled with God. They believed great insights came at the cost of normal consciousness. Nietzsche was living proof. As he wrote in his last letter, "The world has become perfect. Everything dances with joy. Not only am I the discoverer of the first joyful knowledge, I am also the first tragic philosopher." This wasn't just philosophy anymore. It was a dangerous experiment in consciousness itself. Nietzsche wasn't just thinking new thoughts. He was pushing human awareness to its absolute limits. And as we'll see next, what happened when he reached those limits would change how we think about the relationship between genius and madness forever. What he discovered in those final months, before silence took him, wasn't just philosophy. It was a map of the human mind's furthest boundaries, written by someone who went too far to ever return. Imagine spending 10 years in absolute silence, not because you can't speak, but because your mind has gone somewhere beyond words. That's what happened to Nietzsche. But the real story isn't in his silence. It's in how he got there. Here's what's fascinating about Nietzsche's final breakdown. It didn't start with the horse incident in Turin. The signs were appearing months before. In his last active year, his body was betraying him in every way possible. He suffered from violent stomach cramps that left him bedridden for days. His eyesight was so bad he could barely read his own writing. His migraines were so intense he would bang his head against walls for relief. But instead of slowing down, Nietzsche saw his physical suffering as a gift. In one of his last letters he wrote, "My physical problems are my dogs. They bark at everyone who tries to disturb my thoughts." He believed pain was sharpening his mind, pushing him toward greater insights. His daily routine in those final months was bizarre. He'd walk for 8 hours straight through the streets of Turin, muttering to himself. His landlady reported that she would hear him pacing his room at all hours, laughing and crying alternately. He started signing his letters with different names: the Crucified One, Dionysus, and sometimes just God. But here's what's really interesting. Even as his mind was fracturing, his philosophical insights kept coming. Just 2 weeks before his final collapse, he wrote what many consider his most profound letter. "I have just discovered that there is no truth, only interpretations. And this too is just an interpretation." The actual moment of his breakdown was like something from a tragic play. On January 3rd, 1889, he saw a cabman whipping his horse in the Piazza Carlo Alberto. Nietzsche ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck and collapsed in tears. When he was taken home, he started writing bizarre notes to his friends, signing them the Crucified One. What happened in his mind at that moment? Some psychiatrists think it wasn't just random madness. They believe Nietzsche's mind, stretched to its absolute limit by years of isolation and intense thinking, finally broke when it encountered simple, raw compassion. The man who had written "God is Dead" broke down trying to save a horse from suffering. His friend Overbeck rushed to Turin after receiving a disturbing letter. He found Nietzsche playing the piano with one finger, repeatedly striking a single note. When asked what he was playing, Nietzsche replied, "I am writing the world's history with one finger." The next 11 years were spent in almost complete silence. His mother and sister cared for him, but the great philosopher who had written about the depths of human consciousness was now lost in those depths. He would occasionally mutter fragments of his old writings, or play snippets of Wagner on the piano, but mostly he just sat in silence, staring into space. What's most chilling is his last coherent note, found in his room in Turin. "This experience of divinization of all things is still my life, my happiness, my invention. The price for being the first tragic philosopher is terrible. I am paying with my reason." Nietzsche had pushed human consciousness to its absolute limit, and in doing so he mapped the territory where genius and madness meet. His journey wasn't just a philosophical adventure. It was a warning about what happens when we push our minds too far, in search of ultimate truth. Looking back at Nietzsche's tragic end tells us something profound about the limits of human consciousness, but it's the final lesson, the one he paid for with his sanity, that really matters. Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, once wrote, "The mind can go either direction under stress, toward positive or toward negative, on or off. Think of it as a spectrum whose extremes are unconsciousness at the negative end and hyperconsciousness at the positive end." Nietzsche didn't just describe this spectrum, he lived it until it destroyed him. Modern neuroscience is just starting to understand what Nietzsche discovered through experience. Studies show that extreme isolation, combined with intense intellectual activity, can create states of consciousness that look like both enlightenment and madness. Nietzsche's famous quote, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you," wasn't just poetry. It was a warning from someone who'd been there. But here's what makes Nietzsche's story truly relevant today. We're living in an age of mental extremes. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs talk about biohacking their brains. Students use smart drugs to push their cognitive limits. Creative professionals work in isolation for days, pushing their minds to breaking points that Nietzsche would recognize. His sister Elizabeth wrote something haunting in her diary during his final years. Watching him sit silently in his chair, occasionally humming to himself, she noted, "Sometimes I wonder if he finally found what he was looking for, and it was too much for any human mind to contain." The real irony? Nietzsche himself gave us the warning we needed years before his breakdown. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he wrote, "One should hear the yes and no of your body. There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy." But he didn't follow his own advice. He pushed past every warning sign his body gave him, seeking truth at any cost. In his final moments of sanity, embracing that suffering horse in Turin, perhaps Nietzsche finally understood something that all his philosophy had missed, that compassion, not truth, might be the highest human capacity. The man who had written so harshly about weakness spent his last conscious act trying to protect a suffering animal. As his friend Peter Gast wrote after visiting him in his silence, perhaps he went mad not because he saw too little, but because he saw too much. In the end, Nietzsche's journey shows us that the human mind, remarkable as it is, has limits. And sometimes the bravest thing isn't pushing past those limits, it's knowing when to stop. The true genius of Nietzsche might not be in the works he wrote while sane, but in the map he drew with his descent, a map showing us exactly where the human mind's breaking points lie. In his madness, he became what he had warned us about, a cautionary tale about the price of pushing consciousness too far. Remember, as you chase your own truths and push your own limits, sometimes the abyss doesn't just stare back, sometimes it follows you home. There's a famous quote that goes, "Be humble, for you are made of earth. Be noble, for you are made of stars." But Nietzsche's story adds a crucial warning. Be careful, for you are made of breakable things. Look at where his mind ended up, in a quiet room in Weimar, Germany, where he spent his final decade in silence. His body lived until 1900, but his mind never returned from wherever it had gone. His sister Elizabeth would bring visitors to see the great philosopher, now reduced to quietly humming to himself while staring out the window. Some days, he would repeatedly whisper his old words. What is truth? The strangest part? His fame exploded during these silent years. While he sat in his mental prison, unable to understand what was happening, his books were finally being read. The same ideas that broke him were changing the world. By the time he died, he was considered one of history's greatest philosophers, but he never knew it. Today, in his study in Weimar, you can still see his desk exactly as he left it that day in Turin. His papers are scattered across it, some mid-sentence, as if their author just stepped away for a moment. In one of these final writings, he scribbled something that reads almost like a warning to future thinkers. There are heights of the soul from which even tragedy ceases to look tragic. Modern psychiatrists looking at Nietzsche's case suggest something fascinating, that his breakdown might not have been a collapse into meaninglessness, but an expansion into too much meaning. His mind didn't empty out, it overflowed. As his friend Franz Overbeck wrote, it wasn't darkness that took him, it was too much light. So what's the real lesson here? Not that we shouldn't think deeply or push boundaries, but rather, as Nietzsche himself wrote before his breakdown, there is a time for living and a time for witnessing life, a time for dancing and a time for watching the dance. Perhaps the secret isn't in how far we can push our minds, but in knowing when to let them rest. Next time you feel your own mind racing too fast, remember that brilliant winter morning in Turin, when one of history's greatest thinkers threw his arms around a horse's neck and chose compassion over consciousness. Sometimes the greatest wisdom isn't in how far we can go, but in knowing when to stop. After all, as Nietzsche wrote in his last sane letter, the price of truth is terrible, but so is the reward. He paid the ultimate price. The question is, what will we learn from it?